All right. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. How are you today? Good. Excellent. I would like to first introduce myself. I'm pretty familiar with most of your faces. So my name is Isaac Morales. I'm with Arkansas Development Finance Authority. I'm program analyst, but also part of the outreach team. So please, if I have not had the opportunity to meet you, I would love to meet you. I work with you guys hand to hand. I guess a lot of the people here can testify. If you ever have any questions, you can always text me, call me, send me an email. I want you to see me as your resource guy, okay? So if you ever guys need anything, I'm your guy, okay? So we also have Derek Rose on the back. Some of you have heard his name. He provides our marketing. He also helps with outreach. So he can definitely help you guys. Currently, I am all through the state of Arkansas. So if you are in Palm Bluff, if you are all the way to Texarkana, Dorado, Northwest Arkansas, Jonesboro, I'm your guy. Okay, so again, I would like to welcome you to this training. We are very proud of this journey. We have made several changes, very necessary changes. So what I want you to come in with today is definitely erase the conception of what you have of what the ADDI program is currently. Doesn't mean it's gonna be totally wiped out, it's not the same thing, but I want you to come with a clean, fresh mind of what this new program is. One, so you don't get confused to what it used to be. And two, so you're ready to learn and really digest all this material. Is it better? I really believe so. It's gonna help more borrowers. It's gonna help them with higher amounts. Do we have different requirements? Yes. Do we have higher requirements? Perhaps. But remember, like the Superman movie, you know, with a high power comes a high responsibility. Same thing with these programs. We wanna be able to provide higher for these borrowers, the ones that need it the most. And remember, these type of borrowers that qualify for these programs are gonna be your higher centers of influence. They're gonna be the ones that are gonna be more thankful that you help them with this program because they're more likely to speak to others about how much you help them than somebody else that walk in with some down payment already on their pocket, okay? So the first person I would like to introduce is gonna be our president, Mark Conine, and he's gonna give you a little welcoming on behalf of ADFA.
Hi, thank you for being here today. I'm Mark Conine. I'm president of ADFA. And, ADFA, I was thinking about it, we're one of the few state HFAs that uses home funds for forgivable down payment product. And I had met with some of the Southeastern Conference, if you will, but I was meeting with a lot of the Southeastern states a couple of weeks ago. And it was amazing to see how they run their program versus how we run our program. And what it really made me think about was not us, but it was really you guys, is what I was thinking about such a strong partner you guys have been, and certainly in this interest rate environment. A lot of the premium generated down payment programs, have been discontinued in this interest rate environment. And, ours is still healthy, it's still growing, and that's just a testament to you guys. So I really just wanted to come by today and say thank you for being here. Thank you for working with our team. Thank you for Steve for being here. Steve's a great resource for ADFA. We use him for a lot of different things, and we trust him, and he gives us a lot of good advice on a lot of the programs that we run. And we know that over the years that, some of these programs, just by their nature, might be a little frustrating at times. Maybe they're a little bit more cumbersome than some of the conventional products that you use, but you guys have helped us turn this in to a really good program to get our Kansans in homes. And it's just a real testament to you guys. And so we value your input. The team is just really excited that you guys are participating. And so I do thank you for your input because we want it. And I wish you guys could be part of our internal discussions because it's always about you guys. We just don't talk about internally much about what is this going to require us to do. It's, what do the lenders want? What is best for them? What is best for the homeowners? And so one thing that I'm reminded about is we can get caught up in the transactional nature of what we do, right? I can get caught up in that. But at the end of the day, this program, really ADDI and our down payment programs, are trying to get people in a home, right? And try to help them build wealth. And some people, this is the only mechanism, especially during times like this inflationary period where people can build wealth. It's hard for them to put back money each month. And so Sometimes I get lost in that when I think about this program because I'm getting caught up in the financial side of it, or the reporting, or the compliance, or dealing with the people that I'm dealing with, my bosses. And so I'm just reminded that this is a great tool for Arkansans to get in a home. So thank you again for being here. We want to continue doing this as long as we can. We want to offer more down payment assistance products if we can. We want them to be as flexible as possible. And we can't do that. You guys are out there in the market. And so we need your input. So I just want to thank you again for being here. You guys have played a tremendous role in the success of the program. And again, a lot of our Southeastern, I'll call them brothers and sisters, are either slowing down their volume. They've seen a decrease in volume, or they've had to turn off their premium generated products. And, we don't plan to do that. We plan to continue this. And we just need your input on these changes today that the team's going to talk about, and changes going forward, because we want it to be easy for you, as easy as we can make it possible. So just know that. So if you ever have any ideas, reach out to us. But thank you guys for being here. And if we can ever be of help or come to your community, not just to support this program, but any of the other programs that I'm out and about across the state, talking to several of your communities. And so we'd be happy to come out and talk about any of the programs that we offer, whether it's multifamily or single family. So thank you again for being here. And just, if you have any ideas, let us know, because we want to hear them. So thank you. Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Mark. Also, I'm going to do a little housekeeping. I just would like to take a quick second to acknowledge Stephen Lathom. As he's been mentioned several times, he definitely helped us, ADFA, to get this program into better shape. He helped us simplify it to make sure you guys are able to follow along with it, to better participate on this program, and also have an easier process for you guys. So definitely thank you to Steve. There's a couple of things I would like to mention to you guys. I always mention our website. And it's very important for you guys to have it in your desktop as one of your favorites, because this is where you guys are gonna find resources for our down payment assistance programs, whether it's for adding some of the forms and changes, or whether it is just to find the lender program guidelines. A lot of you reach to me and say, hey, where's the question on this? I always love to answer your questions. Sometimes I'm in the road, so if I'm not available, that's what I always like to point you in the right direction. This is actually one of the current ways that you can get access to our lender program guidelines. You go to adfa.arkansas.gov, click on forms on the very top, and then you scroll down to the navy blue subtitle that says single family. I always emphasize that because we do multiple things as a housing finance authority through the state. Single family is where we offer the down payment assistance programs, okay? Now, these are still gonna be the old lender program guidelines. I'm gonna show you where you're gonna have access to the new lender program guidelines and new materials. So we kind of have revolutionized a little bit how we're gonna do some things. So most of you, I would like to think, have access to our lender portal, right? Which is adfa.midas.com/lender portal. If you don't, you can always reach out to me and we can give you access. This is where you guys lock the rate. This is where you guys make reservations. This is where you upload documents and work with the underwriters to clear conditions, submit your closing documents, all that good stuff, the whole process, right? Well, it would just make sense if we, or you guys, have access to the forms, the documents, the lender program guidelines from the same place, right? So when you click now, starting today, in lender forms and documents, as soon as you log in, there used to be nothing under this link. Now you should have access to new documents. And this is gonna be part of these new documents for ADDI. So some of these documents, you're gonna have to have access to them prior to making a reservation into our system. So some of the forms you guys have in front of you, the ADDI lender training package, which Steve is gonna cover all these documents, so don't get overwhelmed looking at all those pages. He's gonna explain to you how they work, but you're gonna be able to download them from here. Also, the brand new lender program guidelines are gonna be accessible through here. So some of you, I see some of you have your laptops, and those of you who are joining us through Zoom, if you can log in into your lender portal, this is where you can download today's PDF presentation. And this is where the package that we hand out to everyone here present, you guys can have access to it. It should be the last one that says ADDI lender training package. So always remember, this is where you're going to be able to have the latest guidelines updated as well. I want to kind of give you a little quick cheat sheet. It's going to be the second page in your package. It's going to be also mentioned throughout this whole presentation. This is going to be kind of like your new roadmap about what ADDI is. What's the process? Am I missing a form? Am I missing a step? What should I be doing? What's next? What should I expect? Okay. So of course, this is brand new. With something brand new, there's always changes. So there might be a little add-ons, there might be quick edits. So just kind of bear with us because again, we're just trying to figure out what HUD wants us to do with this program. They don't tell you specifically how you're supposed to do it, just an idea what you're supposed to do and just follow and don't fall off the road basically. So I'd just like to show you that very quick. Couple reminders, we've been having a couple issues with MERS. I know most of you are mortgage loan officers, but always communicate internally with your company. Make sure that you're obtaining a separate mean number for your subordinates seconds. I know most of you run a system where it's automatic, that you just bring your closing documents and the system generates that mean number, MERS number for you. Make sure there's a separate number being originated from your first mortgage than your subordinates. Okay, because that's the new process since we incorporated MERS. It's been messing some people up, maybe a misunderstanding. So we've been trying to put enough information out there to let you know there has to be a separate MIN number for your subordinate seconds. The reason now is because the documents, closing documents were closing under our name. Now their closing documents for the subordinate seconds are closing under your name. So you have to transfer those, or your team has to transfer those to us and reassign them, okay? So that's the proper way that needs to be closing on these subordinate seconds. So if you notice that on your end or your processors, always kind of make sure everybody's bringing knowledge to this topic. Make sure that your closing documents are being signed properly. Make sure that you are actually transferring those and making sure that you are endorsing, or make sure your team knows to be properly endorsing those notes to ADFA. Just remember, the reservation lock term is 15 days prior closing. These rate environments, I know sometimes the sooner you lock, the better, but that definitely, you guys have no idea how much it helps us with our investor to be able to make sure these loans are being delivered and purchased between 60 days from reservation. Okay, you've seen the crazy environment out there. We really, our boss, Robert Arrington, he's definitely pushing to make sure we offer the best rate available for you guys because it's competitive. But these are also subordinate seconds on the secondary market. So I want to say our rates are very, very competitive compared to other. So that definitely helps us a lot. I know you have some compliance to meet on your end, just which each company works the best, but try to lock the rate just the latest as possible when you're about to do your LE, or everybody has a different process. So I can give you exactly a roadmap, but that's what we ask of you. Affordability, make sure that the borrowers are aware of the affordability periods when you're doing ADDIs. Some of them call asking about resubordination, or perhaps they're trying to sell their homes. Who blames them on this great environment when it comes to making some money out of your house? Basically, what it means, affordability, is the period they have to stay on the property to be fully forgiven for that subordinate second. Remember, it is not a grant, so please do not present it as a grant. It is a loan, it is a subordinate second. We're placing a lien on the property, so make sure they do understand that, okay? Because we do have some questions about, like, I didn't know, I thought it was a grant. Please remember, it is not a grant. Do not present it as a grant, okay? ADDI, as you might know today, it's gonna go higher. When it comes to going all the way to $25,000, Steve's gonna cover all this. If they do 15 and less than $15,000, the affordability period is what you guys know, the 5 years forgivable, right? If they go above 15,000, it's gonna go all the way to 25,000, depending. That's 10 years. So that's double the time. So please remember that. And again, it's prorated, forgivable per month. Some of the other changes are gonna be the forms that we are comparing. I already show you where you can get some of those forms. We're gonna change the front ratio with ADDI. You guys are already aware of the minimum $500 borrower's contribution. The inspection is going to change. Steven's going to cover that. We're no longer doing an HQS. It is a resemblance of that, and it's called a UPCS inspection. And there's going to be a lead-based PIM visual assessment also incorporated as part of that for properties prior to 1978. Liquid assets is going to be the new one. You guys already get liquid assets for your underwriters. So we're not reinventing the wheel. We're just asking something you already have, okay? Minimum 2 months, principal, interest, and reserves, right? Taxes and insurance. I know this is a big one on this program, but we want to make sure we set up these borrowers for success. Okay, and this is something that we try to push back, but definitely HUD is something that they recommend and want on these guidelines. So just bear with us on this. When are these changes taking effect? These changes are going to be taking effect for reservations starting on June 1st. So literally just next week, okay? So if you have a question about my current reservation and the future reservation, if you're willing to take under the new amount, you're gonna be subject to the new underwriting guidelines, okay? We're working with you, but just kind of keep that in mind, okay? So again, any loans starting June 1st for ADDI, you can start increasing that reservation up to 25,000. How much do you get? Well, Steve is gonna be answering those questions, okay? Yep, okay, so that's all I have for you. Again, I thank you for being here. I know you're important. Your time is very important, especially right now. We're about to get in the heavy season. It's been a crazy market. It's been a crazy year. So again, thank you for your time. All those on Zoom, please pay a lot of attention because I'm telling you, this is a lot of changes. So, all right, Steve, I'll give the floor. Thanks for being here, guys. I'll be on the back if you have any questions.
Thank you, Ed. Well, good morning, everybody. You can hear me? And if just let me know, Derek, if anybody's having trouble with the audio feed online from this mic. So real quick, the slide I always have to do, but I hate, right? Because like it's not fun to like, you know, I'm cool stuff. But a little bit about my company. I work for a group called TDA Consulting. It's unlikely that many of you have heard of us before. Because we often wouldn't be interfacing with the loan officers. But a little bit about what we do. We're in our 25th year, founded in 1998. We're a small consultancy focused on housing and community development programs, primarily HUD-funded programs. We're actually HUD's lead technical assistance provider under its department-wide, what they now call Community Compass technical assistance program. It's not quite as sexy as it sounds. It means like in addition to doing the work, right, this type of work, we also have to kind of manage some of the administrative things around keeping 90 different firms that work for HUD all rowing in the same direction, right? And as you can imagine, that's a challenge. In addition to our work for HUD, which is about half of our company's work, historically was closer to 90% over many of the first years of the program, we do a lot of direct work for state and local governments that receive home funds, whether it's the home program, which is what as the underlying source for ADDI, CDBG, Community Development Block Grant. Maybe some of you have also heard at least a decade ago of the Neighborhood Stabilization Program, NSP, that is a program that still actually can't quite get closed out, even though it hasn't received any new funding for better than 10 years. And so in that work, we do a whole range of different things. Training, like I'm here to do, working with, in this case, ADFA on their program design. Sometimes we work with smaller local jurisdictions doing their underwriting and helping them close their multifamily transactions in particular, that kind of stuff. So the nice thing about the mix of work is that by having that direct relationship with HUD headquarters, we kind of have a sense of the orthodoxy of what HUD expects, but by doing that real work in the field, we're up, up to our elbows in the blood and guts of how you make this thing work in the real world. And so it's an interesting role because sometimes what HUD expects is not practicable, and sometimes what we'd like to do is too far away from what HUD expects. We're trying to find that balance. Again, we've been working with ADFA for a couple of years on a range of different programs across the agency that are funded with HUD dollars. Work with a lot of other states, Georgia, Kentucky, West Virginia, South Dakota, Missouri, Washington State. At any given time, I'm working with about six to 10 states across the country with these types of relationships. I've been with TDA for about 11 years now. Prior to that, I spent 11 years at the Michigan State Housing Development Authority, the sort of ADDI of Michigan, as it were. Prior to that, I spent a little bit of time in local government. Prior to that, I worked for a nonprofit. So I've been working in affordable housing in one sense or another throughout my entire career. Yeah, for those folks online, I will kind of step out of the camera view from time to time. It's more important that you see the slides than that you necessarily see my talking head, but I will try to get in front of the camera from time to time, but also get out and talk to the folks in the audience. In any event, so I've been working with these programs really my entire career. If ever you need it, you've got my contact information here, but mostly your contact really is the ADFA staff, and then they can consult me as needed. They're going to be your day-to-day source of answering questions and things like that. I help them make sure that the answers they give not only work, but work from a HUD compliance standpoint. Okay, more than enough. What are we here to do today, right? What are my goals? My goals in terms of the training. First and foremost, we want to provide you with some context for the changes that you're going to see in ADDI. I know the program has kind of been, on sabbatical for a little bit. And there's two big sets of context that we'll keep touching on. Obviously, responding to changes in the market. The world continues to change around us in unexpected and not always pleasant ways. And also kind of addressing some concerns that have come up in really kind of a, we all go to the doctor, hopefully you're supposed to, on an annual basis and have that checkup. Bureaucratically, from time to time with these programs, particularly with federal programs, you kind of got to do that same checkup and make sure that, hey, are we doing the right things? Are we hitting the right notes in terms of the latest HUD guidance and those sorts of things? So some of what we've done here with ADVA is kind of identify, hey, there's some things that HUD would probably say we need to be doing better, and we wanted to make sure that the program was compliant, because if it's not, the money's going to stop flowing. So we want to make sure that it continues to get out there. We're going to highlight some of the new and revised underwriting policies, the ones that I think are going to be the sort of biggest issue to pay attention to, or probably the newest, as it were, is really a more nuanced approach to front-end ratios and the consideration of the buyer's assets that Isaac touched on. So again, we'll dig into those. There's a new tool. It's really an Excel sheet that we're going to be walking through, called the Qualification and Compliance Tool. And so we want to kind of orient you to that sheet, to that worksheet, kind of learn how to use it. We're going to actually do some screen sharing and go in and kind of play with it live with this example project to kind of show you how that works. And then hopefully that kind of gives you a little bit more feel. Obviously, you're going to go back to the office and start to use it for real. So we want to give you some basic grounding in it, so it's not just like, how do I use this, and have to do it entirely from trying to read the instructions, right? Because who likes to read the instructions? And then going through other changes to the program, and again, the context for those and some of the more administrative stuff that you're going to see. So those are the goals from my end. If you've got anything else that you really want to know, we're going to try to provide opportunities for questions along the way. We'll pause at a couple of different points as well. So, generally speaking, you got a question as we go, just raise your hand and we'll get to it. I don't like to do the, hey, let me talk for a whole hour and then pause for questions. We'll also have some question pause spots. Inevitably, with a rollout like this, or kind of a re-rollout, there will be some questions you come up with that we didn't quite anticipate, that maybe ADVA needs to go back and think through. So there will be some questions we just have to defer for one reason or another, but we've tried to preemptively think of all the things that we expect folks to key on. The number one rule in adult education, right, is you're going to get out of it what you put into it. So please take the opportunity to contribute to your own learning and that of your peers. Remember to set your cell phones to stun. The way the world is today, I'm not going to be offended if you got to get up and take a phone call, but let's try to do that in a way that that is not disruptive to everybody else. The plan for today, we're gonna break for lunch around 11:30, come back at 1. So we kind of got a morning segment and an afternoon segment. Those segments are short enough that we're not going to have kind of breaks in the middle. Obviously, if you need to, restrooms are out the door, down the hall to the left. There's some vending machines beyond that, all of that. For those of you that are on the Zoom, which Derek tells me we have about 250 people on the Zoom. So there's a lot of folks out there joining those of you that are here in the room. We were going to leave the Zoom meeting open during that lunch break. So you can just kind of leave your computers, leave it up, and then we'll come back at 1 o'clock. So just know you don't need to log out of the meeting. It'll stay on and you can stay in. Okay. So just some basic background, right? ADDI, the Arkansas Dream Down Payment Initiative, is modeled and sort of borrowed the name from a HUD program from back during the second Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration, called the American Dream Down Payment Initiative, right? That was a program that was kind of glommed on to the home program. It was a set aside within the Home Investment Partnerships program. It was only funded for a few years. And in some ways, there's certain folks that were like, well, why did they do that? Like they could have just put more money into home, right? It was home dollars with this special flavor. So it hasn't been funded since 2007. But the home program always, from the beginning, has allowed what are called participating jurisdictions, right? PJs, not pajamas, PJs, participating jurisdictions. Those are the state and local governments that receive the home grant from HUD. PJs have always had the opportunity to provide down payment assistance to low-income buyers, right? Some programs limit that to first-time buyers. Some programs open that to anybody that's income eligible. So you'll see some variation across the country. The home program, like any federal program, evolves and changes over time, right? As it relates to using it for down payment assistance, some of the things to focus on in 2013, which is several years ago, there was a major shift in the program. It was really the first time in 20 years that the regulation was comprehensively updated. So it affected stuff all through the program, but included applying a specific expectation that agencies like ADDI have buyer underwriting standards when they're providing down payment assistance. The 2013 rule made, again, big changes. It took a while for HUD to kind of issue all of the guidance, and frankly, some of the guidance still isn't out. In particular, in 2018, they issued what's called a CPD notice, right? CPD is the Community Planning and Development Division of HUD. FHA, lives over in a different part of HUD. Sometimes they don't even know that they both work for the same agency. But they issued a CPD notice that dealt with this requirement for home buyer underwriting policies. It came out late in 2018 as HUD was rolling out the guidance, which takes a little while. We all know what happened in early 2020. We were actually scheduled to go do 26 in-person trainings with state agencies and local governments across the country in 2020, and none of those happened, obviously. Also, the Dodd-Frank Act led to this requirement for home buyer counseling that cuts across all of the HUD programs that involve counseling in any way. So it explicitly required that recipients receive home buyer counseling, and also finally went into effect fully last year after having been delayed with the final implementation date for the pandemic. So all of those kind of different regulatory changes over time are part of the context for why we've gone through with ADDI to kind of say, hey, what have we been doing, and are we up to snuff? Are we hitting all of those things that HUD wants? And so the changes, many of the changes are really just designed to make sure that we're fully compliant and addressing HUD's latest guidance. and trying to do that in a way that is as user-friendly as possible, right? Still a federal program, so I know that we're always going to chafe at some of the paperwork. But that's a huge part of the context. The other part of the context, though, that I don't have to, I'm sort of stating the obvious, you guys are the ones doing this every day, is that housing affordability is a huge issue, right? The market around us is changing. It's interesting, encouraging in certain ways and frustrating in others. My whole career, I've been working in this stuff, and 15 years ago, if I attended a wedding of a friend and was sitting at a table with, the groom's uncle, and hey, what do you do? And I work in affordable housing. Oh, isn't that nice? You're like off trying to save the world, Now, like, housing affordability is not this like, hey, yeah, we know there's low-income people that need help, but it's a broad-based thing. It's hitting the mainstream media. It's just part of the public consciousness right now. And so it's encouraging because that means there's new attention and in some cases new resources for our industry. It's discouraging because it's been going on for a long time, and as a country, we've not fully addressed it. Just a couple of things I looked up. Some of this is even out of date, just in the last couple of weeks, but the FHFA Housing Price Index, right? So they track values. In theory, what they're trying to do is say a given house, the value from this point in time to this point in time, right? How much would it have changed? So for the state of Arkansas as a whole, the most recent quarterly data was through Q4 of 2021. If you go back over 24 months, so prior to the pandemic until the most recent data, the average house in Arkansas appreciated by 32%, right? For those of us that are already homeowners, hey, it's been great. For people trying to get into the market, right, not so good. Even more than that, the last couple of months have brought rapid changes in the interest rate market. So as of January 6th, the first weekly Freddie Mac national rate that we all kind of look at as an index, in January, that was 3.22%, $150,000 mortgage, basically at that rate, 30 years fixed, $650 a month in principal and interest, right? Not bad, not bad. May 5th, rates are up to 5.27%. We're up over 200 basis points. We're now up closer to 5.5, I think, right? The same mortgage, P&I cost $830. $180 a month. The reality is the people that this program works with in particular, they can't afford $180 a month more. So what does that mean? For the same $650 payment, their purchasing power went down by $32,500, right? So that's a huge part of the context as well to some of the changes that ADDFA is making, not only to kind of, hey, let's make sure that when HUD comes in and checks us out that we're going to get a clean bill of health, but also what's going on in the world around us to make this program more effective for more people, as opposed to the market just moves so far away that it's not an effective tool. So the key policy changes, right, that we're going to focus on. One, we're in response to the market, ADDFA has said, hey, limiting ourselves to $10,000 is not going to work anymore, right? And so they're going to go up to $25,000. The other change that comes along with that is, instead of, in the past, the assistance really was limited to the cash to close problem of affordability, right? Limited to the down payment and the closing cost, but people still needed to afford the base mortgage. Home allows, broadly speaking, not just the down payment and the closing cost assistance, but mortgage buy down, principal reduction, right? We use different terminology, but helping somebody, hey, it's not just that you need the cash to close, but you can't afford that 97% LTV loan. We can actually provide some of the direct purchase financing with home to be able to make that mortgage affordable to you. So in addition to increasing by $15,000 the cap, ADDFA is now allowing the ADDI to be used in part for that buy down so that we can address the gap, not just of the, you got to have the down payment and you got to have the closing cost cash out of pocket, but the monthly payment's not affordable. We buy the principal down, we bring that monthly payment down. Okay. Within the context, one of the things that you're going to see as a difference is that we do have very explicit standards about the front end ratio. So ADFA traditionally has kind of just focused on the back end ratio only. We're not changing the back end ratio, it's still 45%, but we're not going to let somebody, we're not going to subsidize them into ownership with the home ADDI program if their front end ratio is higher than 33%. People just, the reality is a lot of our folks are coming in already with some consumer debt. We know that. And even if they're not, we don't want to use all of their debt capacity on their house because people still are going to need to go get a car loan. That people just have to be able to have some level of credit to function, right? In today's world. So no more than 33 because we want to make sure that people aren't over leveraged, right? So one of the lessons that seems like we hopefully learned 10, 15 years ago, but as time goes by, maybe we didn't always learn it, right? We're seeing some of those subprime products really kind of creeping back into the market. But because we're also now subsidizing the payment by subsidizing the amount of principal they need to borrow, we have to kind of look at it the other way too and say it's axiomatic that the more money I give somebody, the more affordable it is. But how much do people need to do to be able to kind of help themselves before we kick in and help? And so we've established a minimum front end ratio of 25%, right? If somebody comes in with zero consumer debt, generally we're going to expect that they're going to take a loan that's 30% of their income. If they already have consumer debt that's enough to start to eat into that ratio, we can accommodate that because, again, that's the reality of low-income populations, right? But at some point, we're arguably using a housing subsidy to subsidize somebody's existing consumer debt. So the idea here is if they can't afford 25% of their housing, 25% of their income towards housing, we're not quite ready to subsidize their housing with the home program. That minimum front end ratio only kicks in if the ratios are what is limiting the mortgage, right? So if the loan to value ratio, I'm buying a $100,000 house and you're going to limit the loan to 95%, or say it's FHA, 96.5%, right? Yeah, on paper, I could afford the payment on 120 or 150, but I'm buying a house where the loan is capped by the LTV. There, if that's only 20% of my income, no problem, because we're not buying them down. We're just covering that cash to close, right? So that minimum ratio is not like everybody has to, we're not going to force somebody to go buy a bigger, more expensive house before I help you. And then we've also added explicit consideration of a buyer's liquid assets, right? And this is something that the conventional market has really, looked at for a long time. Last time when I refinanced, a couple of years ago, like they were like, hey, like, where are you coming up with the closing cost? And we don't see that in your bank account, right? And we want to see that you're not spending everything down. And part of it is at a separate account that they thought was a retirement account, but was a cash account. And they're like, oh, okay, right? So you guys ask that kind of question in your regular conventional products all the time. And HUD has required that PJs consider those liquid assets. HUD says, hey, you've got to have a policy around this, but you come up with the metric. And so there's a little bit of discretion, but also a little bit of challenge there to come up with something that works, that meets the requirements, meets the basic expectations, but balances these different things. We set that asset expectation too high, nobody's going to qualify. If we let people spend every last dollar they have to get into the house, and 2 weeks later, the car breaks down or needs 4 new tires, or somebody misses 2 weeks of work because they catch COVID and they don't have paid time off, we've not left that family with a margin. And so we've kind of, again, there's this floor and ceiling effect. The ceiling, which I think will come into play very rarely, If somebody actually manages to have more than $25,000 in the bank, well, then we don't need to be subsidizing them, right? Unless they're at least putting the more than 25 towards the house. At that point, if they're spending down to 25 and they still need help, ADDI can assist them. That's not going to come up very often, right? Occasionally, you may have somebody died and there was a little bit of an inheritance. Maybe they had a, maybe they were in a personal injury loss. But, rarely are we going to come across folks with those kinds of assets. When we're looking at those liquid assets, we're also deliberately excluding 401k, tax preferred retirement accounts, health savings accounts, or educational accounts. So we're not going to ask somebody to spend down their retirement to get into a house, right? So if it's an IRS tax preferred account, we don't consider it for purposes of do they have liquid assets. But the bigger focus is going to be making sure that after they've made that contribution to their housing, that at least at the snapshot in time that we're looking at, that they've got at least 2 months of the projected payment available. And that's a pretty modest standard, frankly, right? On the conventional side, it's not uncommon to see 3 or even, depending on how big the loan is, sometimes 6 months of an expectation. So, but we're bringing that perspective to ADDI in a way that's not been there before. So we just want to kind of call that out. In order to help kind of balance all of this and make sure we're all looking at things the same way, what we've put together is this qualification and compliance tool. And for those of you that are in the room and have the paper handout, this is the one that kind of, you see the yellow and the gray, it's maybe 2/3 of the way back, 3 pages. It looks like an Excel spreadsheet. For those of you joining online, again, Isaac told you where you can go kind of find that download, and you can pull it up. If you're at your desk, you can print it. If you're not, you can open it in a separate side-by-side window and kind of look as we go. And in a minute, what we're going to do is go into the Excel sheet. We're going to do some screen sharing and kind of do a little bit of demonstration about how this works. But we've got a base kind of example here for you. When we get into the tool, you're going to see, and a little bit of this is just like, hey, let's talk about Excel. So as most of you know, an Excel file is really called a workbook that can be made up of multiple worksheets, right? So there's 3 worksheets in the file. There's part A, part B, and part C, right? We're going to just go with something nice and easy. Part A is an optional tool. It's kind of a pre-qualification tool. The idea is I might be sitting across the desk from a buyer who's kind of, hey, like, I'm interested in buying a house. I don't have anything in mind. I don't know how this works. What's it going to take to get me into a house? Like, can I even qualify? And where you are able to sort of say like, hey, I think this person may be an ADDI candidate, right? Sometimes you got somebody coming to you at that stage. And so this is a tool that can be used there. Later, once we've got a real buyer with a specific house in front of us and they're ready to fill out a more formal application, you're gonna go on to part B. And so if somebody comes to you and they already have that purchase agreement, like, hey, I need to get a loan, you're gonna just start with part B. You may not end up using part A. That part B is gonna get submitted to ADFA as a part of your commitment package to them, where they're gonna review and say, yes, we're gonna buy this loan, or we're not gonna buy this loan, right? And so it really informs making the initial commitment. The part C, kind of, and when we see it, you're going to see it repeats a portion of part B, and we re-enter some of the data because from the point that you submit it to ADFA for commitment until we close, we know that some of the numbers are going to move, right? If we close Friday instead of today, the prorations are going to move. And so we need a way to kind of check that again at the sort of very end and make sure everything balances. And part C in particular is designed to be very closely aligned to and able to be reconciled to the closing disclosure. So that's another thing that's in your packet, is a closing disclosure, kind kind of mock up. It's a little simplified just to save on some paper and not print all of the pages that here don't necessarily come into play. But so for those of you again in the room or who have printed this, you might even want to just break your packet apart so you can look at these side by side when we go into the Excel. From an Excel standpoint, the file that you're going to be able to download from ADDI is locked, so you can't overwrite accidentally. So there's only certain cells that you can enter data in, just to make sure that we don't accidentally delete a formula, right? Sometimes people are like, hey, I think this should be the number here. They enter the number that they think is supposed to be there, and they've just overwritten a formula, and suddenly the integrity of the whole thing is kind of blown. So we've kind of tried to protect it from that kind of inadvertent error. There's a bit of a, one of my colleagues sometimes like to say, to format is to live. And I'm like, dude, you're too into paperwork. But there is some visual clues here for you. Yet those kind of light canary, light yellow cells, that's an input cell, right? So those are the only cells you should be inputting data in, with the exception of there's one orange cell, and an orange cell is also an input cell. The reason I mark it orange is sort of a special case input. And so we'll see how that works. You may or may not use it, depending. If it's not highlighted, if it's just a white cell, then it's locked. And it means that, hey, this is either it's just part of the layout, it's the line name or whatever, or the numerical result in the cell is being calculated for us. If we don't like the answer, either it's because the answer is not what we wanted, or because we've put the data in, put data in the wrong place, maybe someplace else. When we get into the file, what you're going to see is there are line by line instructions, because you're not always going to be able to just get on the phone with somebody. So off to the right, outside of the printable area, right, there's a whole column of, hey, line 1, line 2, line 3, and it tells you either this is what you should be entering, or it kind of explains the formula result. So that's there as a, just to, again, give you the resources to be able to use this, but so that every time you print this, you don't print 4 extra pages of instructions that we're just wasting paper. We've kind of set it automatically to not be inside the print area. What you're going to see when we get into this is that part B, which for those of you that have the paper package, is the first 2 pages is part B, and then part C. So this is commitment. This is at the actual end closing. Several of the numbers get entered on part B and will automatically feed to part C. So you're not completely recreating the wheel. The only ones that we're re-entering on part C are those that we expect may move a little bit between commitment and closing, right? I thought the buyer was going to have to bring $100 to closing and they had to bring $98.17, right? But in order to make this all balance at the end, we'll adjust that to the actual. The other thing I do want to acknowledge is there will be times where we find slight different variations, right? Like, hey, my system is telling me that their payment should be $554.67, and ADDI's tool is saying $554.72. We don't have to worry about that, right? Some of these calculated things, and it's just deep in the weeds of is the underlying computer calculation, did we enter it in whole numbers only? Or did it round it to a whole number and then do the math? Or did it do the whole string of math and then do the rounding at the very end, right? Or did it calculate it to 9 digits and then feed that in? So every once in a while, you're gonna find a little bit of variation that maybe you don't know exactly why it's there. If we're plus or minus $1, no problem, that's entirely expected, okay? And randomly, if like, hey, all of those happen to be, all of the little variations happen to all be in one direction versus kind of, they tend to cancel each other out, maybe we might even be as much as $3 off, and it's not a big deal. But what you're going to see is there's a very close alignment. If you're getting off by more than that, chances are what's going on is that we've kind of entered the numbers wrong. And so we'll be able to call ADDI and get a hold of them, and we can kind of work through figuring out what's actually going on in that instance. So what we're going to do here in just a second is I'm going to exit the PowerPoint and go into Excel, and I'm going to kind of show you and walk through how this tool works. And this is really, the plan is to spend a fair amount of time in this. So we'll walk through it. We'll show you some of the features. You can ask some questions. We can change the scenario and see how it works. You know, in a perfect world, we would all, hey, we'd be in a computer lab, we'd all have laptops, and you guys would have brought a file with you and we'd be putting it in. But that's would have been a lot to ask, right? So, so what we're going to see, again, what you've got in the handout is parts B and C. We didn't do the part A just to try to save paper. And we've got that mock-up of the closing disclosure. On the closing disclosure, you see this red font, red bold. That's not a normal part of the closing disclosure. It tells you, hey, this number, like the loan amount, shows up on line B39 and C39. So B is part B of the sheet, and C, right? And so it shows you either where that number has been entered or where you see the same result. So as we go through, you can kind of see that end alignment, okay? And to make this as real as possible, we pulled this from a real DPA file, you know, that ADDI did here in the last couple of months to make sure that we didn't break any laws or do anything inappropriate. We actually recreated the whole thing and pulled all the identifying information off. So, you know, Ron and Jesse Brown is just, it's boring to me to always say John and Jane Doe, right? So I said Ron and Jesse Brown. But again, this is a real project. The other thing we did is we didn't tie it to the specific income, but we kind of generified the income and did the income in a way that is easier to kind of quickly understand the math, right? Because when we get into it, you're gonna see it. Yeah, I know that $36,000 a year is $3,000 a month. Very few people's income is exactly $36,000 a year, but for purposes of the training example, it's often easier to use math that's a little more immediately recognizable without you having to pull out your calculator. The other thing that you will notice as you start to use this in real life is that there's a pretty close, there's not much that changed between part B and part C. In real life, you're going to have more changes. They're still going to be minor, but in real life, we're going to have some more changes, but we just kind of filled it out in the way we did. So let me switch over. If the folks online are not seeing the Excel sheet, let me know, Derek. So again, I'll blow this up as much as I can on the screen. So along the bottom, part A, part B, part C, pretty simple. Then you've got the title at the top every time, some kind of red fonts like just, hey, pay extra attention. Again, in each of the different sheets, you can go off to the right and you can find this text box that walks through and tells you, this is how to use it. This is what goes on, you know, line 1, line 2, line 3, etc. Tells you what to enter or gives you a brief explanation of how that math, you know, what's the mathematical result coming from. Again, the sheet that you have will be password protected. So if you get in and say like, oh, I think their income is $3,500 a month, Excel's going to say, no, not allowed to change that number, right? You're only allowed to get in and do the numbers in the yellow cells. Okay. We're going to talk more after lunch about the distinction here. So I'm not going to get into too much depth, but what you're going to see on the pre-qualification page is we're going to enter the annual income for eligibility purposes And we're also going to enter the income for underwriting purposes. And part of that is when we talk about eligibility, is a family or a household at or below 80% of the area median income, which is the regulatory requirement to be eligible for home assistance. We have to look at the whole household. There's a really specific set of rules about how we project that income. If the household, if my mother-in-law lives with my wife and I, and is not going to be one of the buyers, and probably shouldn't be signing up for a 30-year loan because, you know, I'm making up some facts, not an evidence, but like my mother's it's not this old, but like if she's 87, why are we going to sign an 87-year-old up for a 30-year mortgage, right? And so in that case, there might be a distinction between is the family income eligible? We have to look at everybody versus what's the income that's available to make the payment. So we would exclude a non-purchasing adult, for example. And what you'll also see in the program guidelines, in some cases, hey, we've got an applicant, part of their income includes that they're receiving child support. Under the HUD definition, that is income. We count in terms of whether or not that household is income eligible. And in many cases, if there's a consistent underwritable history of that being paid, we would be happy to look at that as a source of income available to the household to help make the payment. But if I know that the child prompting that child support is 16 and a half, I have to count it for HUD purposes because I project forward for a year, but I shouldn't be signing that household up for a 30-year mortgage based on that being there. So if we know it's ending within 3 years, we would exclude that for purposes of how much income is available to make the mortgage payment. The majority of the times, the income between these two lines is going to be the same, but there will be times where the income for underwriting purposes is a little bit lower. So again, in this example, just to keep the math easy, the Brown family, if we were doing a pre-qual type with them, they've got $36,000 a year in income, it's $3,000 a month. I may not even have the credit report yet, but they're telling me, hey, I got $250 a month in other payments. Maybe our internal bank policy is, hey, ADDI would go to 33, but we're trying to do these at 30, 45, right? So we enter the ratios. If you try to enter a ratio that's too high, the computer will say, no, you're going above the limit, right? So we've got a limit, a data validation thing here that doesn't let you say, hey, we're going to do it at a 40% funded ratio, for example. If your bank says, no, hey, we're still going to limit people in anything we underwrite or originate to 43%, you know, you could change that, but it's going to default to 30, 45 as a starting point. 30% of income at $3,000 a month, maximum housing payment of $900, right? 45% ratio, $1,350. You guys know this better than most audiences I talk about. If the existing debt then is more than 15% of their income, it's going to start to eat into their ability to make the payment. In this case, it's not, but let's pretend that they come in and they have $750 a month in existing debt because they just went out and bought a new Ford F-150. So what this is going to do, I'll try to blow this up even a little bit more. What we see here is that, yeah, 30% would be 900, 45% is the 1350. If they've already got 750 in consumer debt, I could underwrite a mortgage with a $600 a month payment. It's not going to buy very much. But now they're not going to be qualified, right? Because they've got so much consumer debt, we'd have to buy their ratio all the way down to 20% to make this work. And there's a balancing act in the home program, right? We've got to provide enough to make sure that we believe they're going to be successful, but not so much that it's excessive and that we put all of our funding out to just a handful of families. So there's always a policy balancing act there. So there are features like this built in throughout this tool that if you go outside of the range, it's going to kind of try to warn you. It doesn't stop you, right? Because you can still print the Excel file and send it in. But if you see one of these kind of warnings pop up in red, you may want to call ADDI before you just send that package through and figure out, are we sure? Is this a real problem? Is this an entry problem? Or is this a scenario where maybe somebody's marginally outside of a metric, but there's a good reason for it that we couldn't have anticipated, and there's a special case here where some sort of a waiver or an accommodation could be made. Then down below, after we've kind of determined how much of a payment can they afford to make, we're trying to say how much, what can we qualify them for? This is where that, and again, you guys know this because it's the way that you probably regularly work. Telling them how much house we know how much payment they can afford, but how much of that payment's going to go to the escrows versus to the principal and interest, we don't exactly know until they find a house, right? Till we know the house, we don't know what the insurance is. We're guessing. But we still need to inform our consumers. So if we say, hey, I don't know exactly until you find a house, but most of the people that we're helping with this program end up with taxes of about $1,200 a year and insurance of about $850 a year, then it's going to do the math there. I'm assuming rarely do we have association fees, but there's a line in case. And so it's going to say, hey, that works out to $171 a month in escrows, leaving $729 available for the principal, interest, and mortgage insurance. Got a question from the...
Yeah, there's a question from an audience member on Zoom. Why does the calculation sheet default to 30%? On the other slide, said you were to default to 33% for the front end. Does that refer to something else? Slide 14.
Sure. So on slide 14, what we said is the maximum is 33. We won't go above 33. What we anticipate is that some of your in-house expectations may be, hey, we still limit, we don't want to underwrite a loan above 30% or this, that, the other thing. So you could enter the 33. We just anticipated that it's common that a lot of folks try to keep that at 30. And so if that was a part of your program, we're not going to try to force everybody all the way to 33%. We don't want to go above 33. But that's kind of the notion. So again, you could take this up to 33, but we just kind of defaulted it kind of 30, 45, kind of erring a little bit on the side of let's be a little cautious, particularly at this early stage with the buyer. So again, this introduces a certain degree of uncertainty, right? It's the kind of circular reference problem of until they find the house, I can't really tell them how much they can afford because I got to know the house to know the taxes and insurance. So we're guessing about taxes and insurance. If that works out, then they can afford $729 a month. Interest rate at 5.375, probably going to get them an FHA product with another 85 basis points for mortgage insurance. It's going to calculate, we expect, again, it defaults to 30 years. We assume that these are 30-year term loans. Using all of that, the computer is going to do the math and tell us, hey, they could afford the payment on $115,593. Again, it's only as good as our assumptions. The biggest variation is whether or not we have the taxes and insurance right, because they've not gone out to find the house yet. With ADDI, their purchasing power is expanded. It's not like, hey, just because you can only get a $115,000 mortgage, you can only go buy a $115,000 house. We can help them with down payment, closing costs, and some write down. And so line 21 is intended to sort of say, hey, this buyer, the sort of upper end of what they ought to be shopping for, if they got the full $25,000, in this case is about $132,600, right? It's not just $25,000 more. Underlying the math is an assumption that their closing costs and prepaids will be about 6% of the purchase. So it kind of does the math backwards and says, hey, well, some of the total has to go to closings and prepaids. How much is now available towards the purchase price? So if I'm sitting across the table from somebody, what I want to be able to do is give them some idea. Again, there's going to be a plus or minus, but hey, if you come in and yeah, it looks like we could probably do this ADDI thing. ADDI's going to expand your purchasing power, but you still need to go shopping for something no more than 130 to 133. Don't come back with a purchase agreement at 180 and think that I'm going to be able to help you, right? Another question from the
Yeah,
Zoom.
follow-up question is, will the sheet then opt out at any figure over 33?
It will, yeah, it will stop you. It will give you an error. So if I try to enter, I can do 33, but if I try to do 35, you see where this one, it kind of turns it red and says, whoa, like higher than what we intended. And it gives you this validation error that says, no, the value. So the Excel sheet underneath has programming that says, don't allow them to put a number bigger than 33% in. Same thing on the back end ratio. If you tried to enter 46, it would do the same thing and say, nope, not an acceptable answer. So there's a little bit of that, you know, kind of help make sure that we don't accidentally enter a number that's outside of the programming, because the computer just does math, right? We could put a 3,700% ratio in, it'll calculate it, but obviously that's nonsensical. Back here.
For the max versus price calculation, are we still going off of county limits as well?
So yeah, so remember there are limits to ADDI, and it's driven, the purchase price limit in ADDI is actually driven by a combination of two different regulatory things, right? So there's a regulatory issue from a mortgage revenue bond standpoint of like, hey, we can't help somebody buy a house more than this. On the home side of things, independent of whether it was an MRB loan, there's also always a limit about how much, there's a maximum purchase price limit. This is just mathematically based on their qualification. We didn't want to, we could build a tool that would automatically go look that up and have you say like, what county are they in? But then we'd have to update it every year and it just adds to the complexity. So you're still going to have to check and make sure, hey, if this number, if the qualification number works out, that like they could go buy something on paper that has a value bigger than what the maximum value in our county is, you're going to need to limit by that. In most cases, we would expect that their actual purchasing power is the bigger factor in what their upper limit is.
So on the 25%,
Mm-hmm.
could that not affect the like say it would be 23%.
Well, and that's why we're going to see this in the next sheet. Here is about how much can they afford to make the payment on. We're not trying to say, oh, go buy like offer more so your payment's bigger. If they are limited by the loan to value ratio, like on paper, maybe we run the numbers and say like, maybe they make $48,000, right? And now we go down and hey, they could buy up to 195, but they go find a house that's only 135. There, the limiting factor on how much of a loan you're going to give them is not about their ratios, it's about the loan to value. When it's about the loan to value, I don't care how low their front end ratio is, because I'm not subsidizing the purchase price, I'm subsidizing the closing cost and down payment, right? Which is a factor of their liquid assets, not their ability to make the payment. So it's only when their ability to make the payment is the limiting factor, right? Again, in theory, like if Bill Gates, no, we're in Arkansas, right? So if somebody from the Walton family walks into your bank, right, and says, I want a mortgage for this $150,000 house, you're still, in theory, only going to give them a loan of whatever 95% of that is, right? Or whatever your LTV limit is. Yeah, they could afford to make the payment on a multi-million-dollar house, but if they're borrowing against a piece of collateral that's only worth 150, you're going to limit how much you loan based on the collateral. So there's always, you know, how much will I loan against the collateral? How much is the borrower's payment capacity? So when the collateral is the driving factor, of keeping the loan lower, then it's okay that they're. Well, and again, this is meant to be, it's not meant to be perfectly accurate. It's meant to kind of give them the ballpark, right? Because what we don't want to do is have to, oh, I can go, you know, like, oh, I'm qualified and let me go find, and they come back with a house that's so far outside the range. But we also might, in this other scenario, right? Again, everything's only as good as the assumptions. And because this, again, it's a pre-qualification tool. So there's some things that we know are gonna be different is, what changed there? 36,000. Did I change another number along the way? Oh yeah, okay, yeah, I raised the ratio. Like, hey, if they find a house at 135, you know, depending on some other factors, they buy a house at 135 and they get the seller to kick in $2,000 towards their closing cost. You know, that 132 is not a black and white line. We know that there's a little bit of plus or minus to it.
I guess my question is really, plenty of times before, you're talking to a customer, they could effectively buy a house for 132, and it all end up basically the same. They go to the 132 match, you're subsidizing the rest of the pool, bring it back down to 115.
Right, now, if they go buy a house at 115, I'm not going to give them 25. Yeah.
But if you buy it at 132, bring it back with subsidy.
Right. Yeah, with the full subsidy, they could buy at 132 because the 115 plus the 25, right, gets you to 140. The spread there is the presumption that we need 6% for closing costs and prepaids. You're buying down the principal. Yeah. Yeah. And that's where, hey, if they come back to me and it turns out that the reality is the taxes on this house are $1,500, but they can get, you know, insurance at $550. Hey, well, that magically comes pretty close. The taxes are $2,000, right? So that's where, again, I think the caution to using this is, hey, we know that this is not meant to be pinpoint accuracy. It's meant to give us a notion of what's likely to be possible, but it's only as good as the assumptions that we build into it. At this stage, I can be reasonably confident about their income and their debts. I can be reasonably confident about what today's interest rates are, what my ratios are, right? But without a specific house, the taxes and insurance are a crapshoot. So if in doubt, I'm going to err a little bit high, right? But again, this is an optional tool. It's meant to, if we're working with somebody ahead of time. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Isaac. And again, what we try to do is leave this, hey, it's, we know that because of the stage, right? Because we don't have all of the information yet, this is meant to be a preliminary estimate, not the end all be all. Right. That's the other message that's absolutely critical here. And that's really part of the whole function of the spreadsheet, right? It's not everybody gets 25,000. HUD explicitly says it's not permissible to have a program that says everybody gets 25. You get what you need, not to exceed 25. And what you need is built around, we're going to apply uniform underwriting metrics, but what you need Josh, because you've got a thing on, right? May be different than what John needs because your income and your personal situation is just a little bit different than his. So we need to give you room to maneuver so that we haven't defined this Goldilocks buyer that like we can not too much, that we've got enough variation about what works without, hey, Thomas, we're going to give him $200,000, right? Because we've only got so much money to go around and we're trying to balance enough to make it work for the people we're trying to work with, but also mathematically, I can subsidize anybody in the house. I may ask them to only get a $10,000 first mortgage. That's not good public policy, right? So there's this balancing act. Enough, not too much. But yeah, the message that I absolutely don't want you to inadvertently send to buyers, and I think you need to emphasize this because people we all hear what we want to hear. Hey, 25, I think I'm going to get 25. You can get up to 25, but we still expect you to take, the way I say it is like, we expect you to take the largest loan you can reasonably afford. You do what you can. Oh, every once in a while, Siri thinks I'm talking to her. Jessica, we want you to do as much as you can within our normal policies and procedures to finance as much of the house as you can afford. We'll make up the difference. And so you might not get as much money as the next person because you can actually reasonably afford a little bit more, right? So the result, the process is sort of equal and transparent, but the results are customized to the family's needs. Let's jump over to part B. Again, part A, you may end up never using this, right? If your buyer comes to you and they've already got a purchase agreement in hand, you're going to skip right past part A.
All right, question is there a general amount like 1% of the purchase price that is the limit when not using the max amount of the funds to buy down the loan?
I'm not sure I understand the question. What I will say, we do have an expectation that a buyer contribute at least $500 to their purchase. So we're not absolutely getting them down to zero out of pocket. For purposes of this, we don't assume that that $500 is not enough to really move this calculation. So we just assume that like we need 6% of the purchase price towards closings and prepaids from ADDI. We kind of just assume that maybe their $500 is all paid outside of closing. But if they want to rephrase the question, we can go back to that. Yeah, right. So we want to see that they've got resources to be able to make at least a $500 contribution towards the purchase, right? And that they've got then 2 months left in reserve. Yeah, so the question was, hey, does their home inspection count towards that if they can show, if it's a POC, a paid outside of closing? Okay. Yeah, if we can document that now, I'm gonna defer, but make a note. This is not that, if they go buy their own home inspection, ADFA is gonna do an inspection that ADFA is gonna pay for. But if they separately do that, or if they pay for their appraisal out of pocket, or they go pay their first year's insurance out of pocket, right? If we can document that it's what otherwise would be a traditional customary closing cost that would have otherwise been on the closing disclosure, but it's a POC, then that can count towards their $500. They don't have to they don't have to have made a deposit or brought a check to closing per se, but we do need to document that they've invested $500 towards their overall purchase. Yes. So here's where what I'll say is I'm an expert in the home program. I don't want to pretend that I'm the expert from like the consumer, the CFPBs, like this is how you fill out the loan estimate. Yeah. Oh yeah, it could be $400 or $500. Yeah. Well, I mean, so if they've gone and prepaid their first year's homeowners insurance, how do you document that to be able to put it onto the CD? Yeah. Right. Yeah, I mean, so whatever your internal process is to document those things that you put on the. Yeah, okay. Yeah. But I would think, I mean, yeah, well, so here's what I would say, and maybe we'll defer this. Yes, so the question for people online was, hey, like if they pay for their home, and if they pay for a home inspection, but that's not on the closing disclosure, can that be counted towards their minimum $500 contribution? The intent that we have is yes. Now, our presumption was that POCs are going to be shown on the closing disclosure. So what I'll say we probably have to take under advisement is, does it absolutely have to be on the closing disclosure? Maybe not. Maybe ADFA can accept, like, here's a copy of the receipt. But we do need to document that if we put a number that said, hey, they contributed this outside of closing, we need to be able to document that, not just have like somebody said they did. Yeah. Yeah. And so, yeah, that would absolutely count. So I would expect that it's going to be common that people will often make most of their $500 contribution through paying for the appraisal up front, sometimes prepaying their first year's insurance. Maybe you also, different banks may be different, right? Like maybe they had to pay the appraisal and the credit report fee or what have you. But that $500 is modest enough that often it will mostly be covered with POCs. And there's a balancing act here that ADFA really tried to work through. We don't want to limit ourselves to people who already have like, hey, you got to have $10,000 in the bank to get any help, right? But we don't want to have people spend all the way down. So we actually backed off of how much cash people are expected to contribute to leave a buffer so it's easier for people to have that 2 months remaining. A lot of other programs across the country have a requirement that, hey, the buyer contribution has to be at least 1,000 or at least 1% of the purchase price. In some places, even 2 or 3% of the purchase. We want the buyer to have, more, but the higher you do that, the harder it is to make sure that people have some money in reserve. So here, in order to protect the buyer and make sure that we're helping people who have some money in reserve to deal with what was the old MetLife commercial, like the If in Life, the Snoopy commercials, right? In order to do that, we kind of backed off of a higher, like, hey, they got to put $1,000 down before they get my house. Okay. So when you get into Part B, and again, what you've got on the screen as the starting point is also what you have on paper in front of you. So this year, I'm embracing my middle age. If it's easier for me to see with the readers in front of me. So if you're having trouble seeing it on the screen, those of you in the room at least, or anybody online who has already printed this, you might want to just look at the paper. So in Part B, this is where you will, in all cases, have filled this out. This is going to come to ADFA as a part of the commitment package. And you may or may not have done Part A. And if you did, it doesn't matter anymore because now we have a specific house. We've got more real data. Part A was just a useful tool along the way, hopefully, but it doesn't have to get submitted. So we'll make sure we've entered the identifying information, made up an address, the date, loan officer, George Bailey. Those of you that watch It's a Wonderful Life every year will remember that name. Same information here. It's similar to what we had in Part A, but again, now we've got a real house. So $36,000, nice, easy numbers for us to do the math in our head. We recognize that's $3,000 a month, $250 in existing consumer debt. Now we go and say, hey, wait a minute, we got a house. It's $105,000 purchase, got a 97% loan to value. So before I even consider the buyer, I know that we won't make a loan bigger than $101,850, right? Even if they could afford the payment on $200,000, I'm only going to loan 101 against the house that's only worth 105. So before we even get to the ratios, we know that the maximum loan would be 101,850. Now we look at the family and say, what's their payment ability? Again, here we've got the 30, 45. You could put in the 33, but if you try to put in 37, it's going to give you an error, right? So the same numbers that we saw before, oops, no, actually, 900, it would be the full 30% ratio, 1350 maximum total debt. They have that full 30% available because their consumer debt in this instance is modest, right? It's not above the 15% spread. Now we have a real house in front of us. We can go look at the taxes and have as good of an estimate as we ever have, because taxes can change next year, of $991, insurance of $1,390. This again was pulled from a real file. So all I did was look at the monthly taxes in the, escrow calculation and multiply by 12. So your taxes are modest in Arkansas. Your insurance, maybe this was like in the tornado part of the state. Right? I mean, on a $105,000 house, like that's, nationally speaking, that's heavy insurance. I wish my tax rate was whatever 991 of, actually that's, hold on, yeah, no, that's great. So now we've got a much more real estimate, right? Of our escrow being 198.42. It's just these things added together divided by 12, leaving 701.58 for the taxes and insurance. This was a little while back, probably not today's rate, but 5.125 interest rate. Here they had MI, but it was not the FHA MI, right? It was private mortgage insurance. The rate for that was 34 basis points, 30-year mortgage. So the maximum mortgage based on the ratios is this family could conceptually afford a $122,000 mortgage based on the ratios. The maximum mortgage, the projected mortgage then, in this case, is the 101,850. Yeah, they could afford the payment on more, but we're not going to loan more against, we're not going to loan 122 against the $105,000 house. So because of that, in this instance, in a second, we're going to see, I don't care what their front end ratio is, so long as it's not too high, right? So over here, their housing ratio is only 26%. I'm not forcing them to try to go up to 33, say like, go buy a more expensive house. And even if this was only, let me just to show you how the sheet's working, we'll go up and say again, 48,000. So if their income was that much higher and they're still buying a house that's well below their purchasing power, their housing ratio is only 19.5%, still not a problem. Because they're already taking the biggest loan that the bank would make against that property anyway. And at that point, my assistance really is being limited to the cash out of pocket for down payment and for closing costs, not to further buy down the mortgage. So I'm not worried that I'm unnecessarily subsidizing their mortgage. Does that make sense? Okay. So that part of that column, as it were, of part B, kind of gets us to, hey, what do we expect the mortgage to be? Now we carry over the sales price that we've already entered. Again, here now we've got a projection of closing costs and prepaids, right? Or you're gonna pull this off your loan estimate. In this case, I just made up a number because all I had was the final closing disclosure, not the earlier loan estimate. But 5250, which is just 5% of the purchase price. At this point, hey, if the buyer had made an earnest money deposit, I would probably know that. I have a copy of that, and so I could enter that on line 35. If I've told them I think they're going to have to bring some cash to closing, I would enter that on line 36. If I expect them to be making their $500 contribution outside of closing, I would enter that here, and it's kind of visually kind of moved over a column just to help us remember it's not in part of the pluses minuses on the settlement statement. We've got the lines here that we don't use at Part B. We don't know what the prorations are. We know there will be prorations, but we don't know what they are. So we don't expect you to try to enter those. So they're kind of just grayed out. Now you're going to enter the buyer's mortgage. In this case, it's the same. It's exactly the same as what we projected. On the other hand, if our buyer's mortgage on the left-hand side was limited by their purchasing power, right? Let's say it was like $100,317. You're probably not going to write the loan at $100,317. You're going to round it off to $100,300 or what have you. If you entered a number here that was more than 1% away of what we expected, it's going to give you a warning. It doesn't mean that it's not a hard stop, but it tells us, hey, we got to look and understand. We thought they could afford this. Why are you saying they can only get this other mortgage? We know that sometimes that's, again, there's going to be a little bit of rounding there. So a little bit of variation, not a big thing. But if we said, it looks like they, if we're all doing the math the same way, they can afford 120. Why are you saying they're only going to take 110? Right? We need to understand what's going on there. So the total buyer assistance needed in this scenario would be projected at $8,400, right? It's the difference between their sales price plus their closing cost, minus any of their cash that would be coming on the closing disclosure, not the POCs. We just count those towards their minimum $500. So the difference there is $8,400. If we knew that they were also getting some other form of down payment assistance, we've seen some files where ADDFA is providing some and Fort Smith is providing some, or maybe the seller said, hey, I'll kick in $2,000 towards your closing cost. We would enter that here. And in this case, we had none. So we expect that we're going to need $8,400 of ADDI assistance for this family. Here on line 43, we re-enter the MI. And here, sometimes what your system is going to do is you're going to have already spit out and say, hey, I actually know it's $31.52. So that's the orange cell, right? It's an entry. Normally, we would start from just doing the math based on the MI rate. If you've entered both, you're going to get this like error that pops up that says, hey, you're really supposed to do one or the other. Which one is really the one that you intended? But again, here we know that the rate was 34 basis points. So we just rerun the numbers, and that we're rerunning them simply because the actual mortgage may be plus or minus a few dollars from what we had done the math on. So at that, the PI is 554, the mortgage insurance 28, total escrow is still the 198. So total payment 781. This next little section just gives us some outputs, some sort of analysis. The mortgage here has been limited by the loan to value ratio. If the mortgage had been limited by their purchasing power, then the result here would say the buyer ratios. Their housing ratio based on this works out to 26.1%. If the housing ratio, it shouldn't let you, but if you entered a number here, it's going to give you like a few different errors. Obviously, nobody's going to get 180, but like, oh, the ratios are too high, right? That's kind of abusing the spreadsheet. So it runs the numbers 26.1, 34.4. We're all happy. The effective actual LTV of the mortgage is 97%. The buyer's cash investment is 500. If we had not entered that, it's going to give us a warning. Hey, it looks like their cash investment is below the $500 minimum. Make sure that we're orienting them to needing to bring $500 in that case to the closing, or, oh, I forgot to enter that they've got the POC. And then the last little bit says, hey, what are their liquid assets? What are their assets after the closing? So it just subtracts the sum of any cash we expect them to bring at closing, any earnest money, and any POCs. In this case, it's just the 500. So they had 3,000 to start with. They're putting 500 of that towards the purchase. They've got 3.2 months remaining. We're solid. They only had $1,000. They don't even have 1 month of the payment left. Again, it's going to give us that warning. Question from the Zoom.
The question is, you mentioned Fort Smith Home Funds. They provide up to $25,000 for new construction. No problem using also your $25,000 in addition to those for a total of $50,000 if we meet the requirements. Question.
Provided the buyer needs it, right? So in this instance, you have Fort Smith that receives home funds from HUD and ADFA that receives home funds from HUD. ADFA says, hey, we'll give up the 25. Fort Smith says, we'll give up the 25. We can combine, but in that case, we both have to agree that the buyer in fact needs the total of 50, not they only needed 37 and together we're going to give them 50. But yeah, we can, if you've got somebody else providing the assistance, additional down payment assistance, right, then we can further boost the buyer's purchasing power in that sense.
Follow-up question is, can the reserves come from gift or Fort Smith grant funds?
No, so in that case, whether it's Fort Smith or ADFA, we can't give them money to just put in their account, right? We can give them money towards the purchase and the closing costs and the prepaid, but we're not giving them money so that they've got some money left. And they need to have the money in their bank. If somebody had given them the cash, and so that they've now got the cash, but we're going to look to see that we've got verification that they did in fact have those assets. Yeah, I mean, I don't think we're really looking to see where their liquid assets came from per se. So if in order to meet that standard, they had, hey, Dad, I need you to, give me a couple $1,000s or this. We don't necessarily know where their cash came from. I don't think we're trying to set up a situation where we encourage somebody just to show they've got a little bit of cash in the account that they've taken it's just not, it's not wise financially. Yeah. Yeah, no, sometimes, yeah. So sometimes people have to go do some kind of credit repair, and that's going to kind of happen probably before we get to this stage, right? You're going to have work. Hey, you got some work to do. You got to go do these things. And then in practice, after they've done that is when you're going to then pull all the file and do the income documentation and everything like that.
So that brings up another question. You kind of brought up 401k, but typically 401ks are eligible in terms of that's still the case in this program. So somebody and we hate to tell them to go and look for $2 grand out of a 401k when they have information, even though they're all.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question. So yeah, it's an agent. Well, here, I think what I'm going to suggest is we probably need to take that under advisement. That's one of those like, I didn't. The way that I've normally looked at this when I work with participating jurisdiction clients is we're just going to ignore those tax preferred accounts, period, right? And so we are looking, generally, I'm looking to see like, hey, they've got a checking and a savings account, and they run an average daily balance that's this, and that's enough. I'm trying to avoid a situation where we expect that if they run into a hiccup, that we're kind of forcing them into pulling from those accounts. Now, whether or not ADFA wants to adopt a policy that says, well, we would let that count towards the remaining assets, that's not the way we wrote it, but it's not impermissible from HUD's standpoint. So I think that's something that we're going to have to kind of put a pin in and come back and look at and make sure that they've got an answer that they're comfortable living with.
When we're pulling funds from home funds or ADDI, there is a lien restriction where ADDI takes second. How will that work? What the city of Fort Smith take second or third lien, or how is that?
In most cases, this is one of those where there's not a HUD regulatory answer, right? This is a sort of how do the two different public funders figure out how to kind of play nice in the same sandbox. More often than not, right? Federal beats state, state beats local. So most state agencies would say, we want our loan to be in the second position. If Fort Smith wants to give them money, we're happy to do that, but they're going to be in third position. And frankly, under the terms of these secondary loans, who's in second and who's in third doesn't have much of a practical influence. So it's possible, unlikely, I hope, but it's possible that you could end up in a situation where like ADFA says, nope, we are always in second no matter what. And Fort Smith says, we're never going to be in third. And they're like, kind of unable to reach an accommodation there. But I wouldn't expect that that's a situation.
Got a few.
A couple more questions.
Got a few questions, and we're being asked to please repeat the questions.
Oh,
From the
sorry. Yeah.
audience.
So the question was, if we've got ADDI money and say Fort Smith money, who gets the second lien position and who gets the third, right? And so again, it's kind of between ADFA and the local government but I assume these guys are very accommodating, and everybody in that situation, both participating jurisdictions have the same basic interest. And so I would assume that in 99% of the real world cases, they're going to reach an accommodation and we're going to be fine.
All right. Question number one is, so reserves can come from a gift from a relative, question mark.
Well, again, I'm going to kind of take that under advisement. Generally speaking, we're looking to see that, hey, this is already money in their account. Now, I don't know if that came from a gift from great Aunt Betty a month ago, right? Or not. So I think we want to kind of take that under advisement and make sure that we kind of write that up in a way that ADFA is totally comfortable with, but also is as workable for you.
So the follow-up to that was, so reserves do not need to be sourced or seasoned.
We're generally looking at the snapshot of like at the point that we did the income asset verification. Yeah.
And then finally, so a gift of funds saved into their account is acceptable for ADFA so long as the gift funds meet guidelines for the conventional FHA, et cetera. If guidelines state gift can't be used for reserves, can ADFA accept the gift funds?
So I think so if they've got a gift that's towards their cash contribution, like towards their closing costs and prepaids, we certainly, like, hey, we know that they're getting a gift that allows them to bring $3,500, allowed them to make the $1,000 earnest money deposit and bring another $2,500 to closing. We would reflect that here. And that's going to adjust how much ADDI assistance they need, right? We've already got somebody, the basic federal principle is the federal government won't pay for an item that somebody else is paying for, right? You don't get to double charge the cost. So in this case, the buyer has to pay their closing costs and prepaids. We're willing to help them. But if we already know that somebody else is giving them some of that, we're not also going to give it to them. So we kind of account for, hey, this is how much they're contributing of their own. If some of their contributing of their own is coming from a gift, we can accommodate that. And I think what we need to do is just be clear on, does that gift get to count towards that they've got to have made their own contribution? In which case we would put it on this other assistance line. Or, oops, 25,000. Or are we going to let the gift from Great Aunt Betty count towards their minimum contribution? Either way, we can reflect it. It's a matter of how we're going to characterize it. So I think, again, I don't want to sort of paint ADFA into a corner, but that's a good clarification to make sure that we come up with some answers on.
In lieu of the rapid increase in the market, house market, when will the sale price limits be reevaluated?
Yeah, so the sales price limits from a home standpoint, HUD updates the home maximum purchase price limits once a year. And so when HUD publishes those for the home program, they're for the home program, and they got published maybe 30 days ago. Those are numbers that are, again, frankly, pretty high. I didn't go look them all up, but I'm sure that they're higher than what we're mostly talking about here. I don't know the specifics of what the regulatory requirements about how they set the MRB purchase price limits. My guess, and Isaac's going to tell us, is that it's probably still a once a year thing based on federal releases of data. But
Yes, with the new ADFA guidelines, June 1st, the ADDI new purchase price limits will be effective, which are already incorporated into the new guidelines. New household income limits will be effective June 15th, correct?
yeah, those just got published on Friday. So
Yeah, purchase price,
For-
ADDI
for
purchase
home.
price limits June 1st, household income limits June 15th.
yep. It's always challenging, right? When you've got like, hey, we've got multiple regulatory overlays. If you're using both, you got to meet the requirements of both programs. So there will be times where, this program on its own might have let somebody buy a house at 200. This program on its own might have limited to the 170. When they're combined, 170 rules. Right? Okay. Now, part C of the tool, really, again, if you look at it, it just repeats the sort of right-hand column of part B, right? The line numbers are exactly the same, this, that, and the other thing. And what's going on here, and this is where those of you that have the closing disclosure, we can pull out and look at, is in part C, all we're doing is updating those numbers that realistically, are likely to have changed between the commitment and the closing. Purchase price, we're not going to make you re-enter it because the purchase price doesn't really change, right? If it did, I guess you'd have to go back and do it in part B. Now we have our actual closing costs and prepaids, and on the closing disclosure, right, that 521759, you see it on a couple of places. You see it obviously at the bottom of section J, and then in the settlement statement, summaries of transaction portion, you see it on line K3, right? So you see how, hey, the CD is going to line up very closely. Here, now we know we've got the CD in front of us, or the draft CD a couple days in advance. Now we know what the adjustments are, right? So we've got some prorations, the ones that are on the top half that are paid by the seller in advance due to the seller. In K7, you see it tells you, hey, you see this number on line C33 of the pro forma of the Excel sheet, right? So the total cash needed from the buyer. We also see in the subtotal on line subtotal of section K from the closing disclosure, right? In this instance, our buyer didn't have any earnest money deposit. They did bring $38.14 to closing. They did make that $500 investment outside of closing. In this instance, that was their appraisal. We've got some other, the credit proration, credits to the buyer portion from the bottom half. We see the buyer's mortgage. It's still the first mortgage is still the 108,850. Now, because these numbers have floated around a little bit, previously we thought the buyer needed $8,400. They really only needed $8,105 from ADDI. So you're going to close the second loan at 8,105, not the 8,400 sort of preliminary commitment subject to final underwriting, right? And the right-hand column here is showing us just the change. So it's just kind of a visual, like, hey, what changed? Where did these numbers move around a little bit? Most of these types of changes, again, very normal for these things to have moved around a little bit. The principal and interest payment, again, is just being calculated. It's already pulled over. Here, we're going to have you re-enter the mortgage insurance. Now you're going to enter it just as the dollar amount because you got it right from the CD. It probably won't have changed much, but again, every once in a while, there's just a little bit of a wrinkle. The escrows, again, might have marginally, barely changed between that initial closing because they went out and decided to go with State Farm instead of Progressive, and it's, you know, 550 instead of 545, you know, whatever. So the escrows may have marginally changed. And then it just reruns the same test again, our mortgage continues to be limited by the LTV. Here, the ratios, nothing has really moved. The payment really hasn't moved, moved by 4 cents, no big deal. Buyer's total cash investment was actually $538. And so it reruns our test and we're all good. So again, once you kind of get the feel for this, you know, part C is just, again, just checking, and, you know, I would keep my example so you can kind of see the alignment between how those work. So I'm going to come over here first and then.
So you mentioned, like, let's say that the insurance, the borrower says, hey, I decided to change insurance companies. My insurance is now this much. And so they fall under that $500 initial investment. They're expected to be at the closing table in 4 hours or 2 hours or however often we have that lead. And so then at that point, we've got to go and change our tax amount, which means changing quite a few different things. Will you allow a principal reduction on it? Or do we have to redo?
That's a good mechanical question, and I think the goal in most cases is that they're not going to have changed like 24 hours before closing, because we're doing what you got to do it like 3 days in advance, right? So we're going to have known that. You can give Isaac's number. Because again, the idea here is that, hey, if I'm that 3 days out and I start to do this and I say, hey, you're only at 475, I need you to be at 500. We're going to have you bring $25 to closing, and the ADDI number would move. The ADDI number can move between the commitment and the closing.
Going to be any leniency as to how much like a borrower could get at closing? We're going to keep moving back and forth to make that zero out. This process is already lengthening. Now we're lengthening.
Yeah. Okay. Again, I think some of those mechanics, I want to just not back them into a corner. There's some ways that we can work with that. Again, one of them is, hey, like, we know we're not locking you in and saying, hey, why wasn't it exactly $8,400? You're actually even going to be able to go up So it might be that it works out, hey, we actually need to take the ADDI from 8,400 to 8,800 to make this work and keep it balanced. But what I would say is don't try to tell your buyers and orient your buyers to, I'm going to keep you to exactly 500. You got to put in at least 500. Most people are going to put in, they might even put in 650, 700, right? Like it's not a game of make sure that they only ever put in 500 and not a penny more. So it's really kind of a matter of who do we expect to be that one that flexes by plus or minus $50 or $100? And so I think that we can figure out a way to kind of manage that.
But when we're down to the end and we're taking that little bit of a difference and can't put it as a principal reduction down just so we can go ahead and move forward.
Okay, so what you're saying is like I've already done the CD and it says it's 8,400, but it really should only be 8,150. Then yes, I would there. I don't think it's a big deal to sort of okay, yeah, we closed it and we did a principal reduction and that's shown, and so they really only got the net of 8,100. That should be doable. That should be doable.
Will we get some specific guidelines on that? Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, this is both of like, hey, let's orient you to what we think, but you're going to have some like, hey, like I got to make this work. So there's a certain notion that we're going to get some feedback that's going to require some adjustment. Yeah. But that's part of why they did build in, hey, like, hey, this amount can flex and you can go up by 500 without going back to ADDI for any additional authority. You can't go over the 25. So if they were already at like 24,950, you can't go up 500. But and then if it's moving by more than that, make sure you touch base with ADDI in terms of going up.
So I have two questions kind of from earlier
Yes.
as well. The worksheet, it looks like it's taking into account always using the full 25,000. Since once it hits 15,000, it's a 10-year recapture. If we're only taking it to 14,999, are we just going to do the math on our own? I mean, is that
well? If what you're trying to do is limit them. If you're trying to say like, oh, my buyer really is concerned about having a 10-year period, then you've got to make it work where like, okay, well, you're going to have to borrow a little bit more. You're going to have to bring more. But we're not trying to arbitrarily just keep them to 14,999 just to keep from going from 5 to 10, right? The 5 that once you hit, so it is 14,999. Once you hit 15, it's 10 years. So it's not 15,001. Just a subtle point. It's just a HUD requirement. But either way, we're going to forgive this assistance over time, right? Like most of these people are going to stay in their house. And even if they had a 10-year period of affordability and they move after 5, if they've met all of the rules, which basically means they continue to live there, they don't default on their first mortgage and lose the house that way, and they've continued to live there, so they haven't turned it into an Airbnb or a rental or whatever, then we're going to have forgiven half of the total assistance. They're only going to pay back half, but hey, they got 25 instead of 15. Yeah, there's this I guess there's a marginal place where, there's a time period where maybe the total amount they'd have out, but we're not trying to kind of back into make them borrow more so that we can keep them in this 5-year period. The 5 or the 10 really, as a consumer, I would encourage them like, hopefully you're buying a house because you intend to be there for quite some time.
I think a lot of our young buyers are not,
Sure.
first-time buyers, and it's like the starting, and then in an environment we're in right now, recapture would not be an issue, but who knows?
Well, and remember, this always should have been the case. It's always the case. The recapture is always limited to the net proceeds of sale. So if we're in an environment we were 15 years ago where values have dropped, when it's time for them to sell the house, if there's not enough cash left to repay the home loan, we will write off the balance of the home. By rule, we are required to. We are required to. So we're never going to ask a buyer to come to closing with cash out of pocket to get out from underneath of that home loan. By regulation, we're not allowed to. We always have to limit the recapture to the net proceeds of sale, defined to be the future sales price, less the senior debt, less reasonable and customary closing costs. Now,
Is there a
if-
time limit on that at all anywhere?
anytime during the affordability period.
Really?
Now, I will say, again, it's, you work long enough, you find these weird, like, hey, nobody. If they try to sell the house to their brother for a deliberately below market price to sort of force their way into forgiveness, no, as one of my former colleagues used to say, that dog don't hunt, right? But if it's a legitimate, like, hey, the market crashed, right? And this house, like, they're selling for, it's a third-party transaction. There's nothing hinky going on. It's just that house they bought for 150 can still only sell for 150. And by the time they pay a normal real estate commission and normal transfer taxes and everything else, and they've only been there for 2 years, so they've barely amortized any principal, then yeah, they're going to be upside down. We can't correct if they're upside down on the first mortgage, but we're going to make sure that home is not the thing that makes them upside down. They may walk away with nothing, but they're not going to walk away with an outstanding debt as a result of home. Yeah, and that should have always been the case. And again, we don't want to, we certainly should tell people, particularly if it's if this is a way to kind of help give people the comfort. That's a sort of a consumer benefit that's built into this program. But we also hope that we don't get there, right? We don't want to be in that situation because that has broader macroeconomic implications for all of us. No, that's fine. Right. So and here's where the language sometimes can get a little tricky. And I'm gonna also say we're about 5 minutes over our scheduled time for this morning. That's totally fine. And we can continue the discussion when we come back. We've got some flex time built in. But and I'm gonna simplify the math even further so that I can do it in my head, right? Because the older I get, the less math I can do in my head. Not that you can really buy a house for 100,000 anymore, but we can all do math on 100. We're gonna buy a $100,000 house. 97% LTV. The down payment is $3,000. Let's say closing costs are another $4,000, right? So, and let's say they're paying all of their $500 POC. No matter what they can afford in terms of a payment, they need $7,000 of help to cover the required down payment and the closing cost. Now you're saying, hey, what if they can only afford 90 instead of 97? They need another 7,000. I'm going to characterize that for purposes of this discussion as a mortgage buy down. Yeah, it's also a bigger down payment, but here what I'm going to say is the down payment for purposes of making these distinctions, the down payment is the required down payment under the LTV. The additional buy down is conceptually a little bit different, right? It's not that it was old school lending and everybody needed 10% down. They only needed 3% down, but they can't, the difference, I'm still going to buy it down. But again, that's where when I'm buying down the mortgage, that's where I'm paying more attention to, hey, they still have to have taken a reasonable payment. Not just like, hey, I only want a $90,000 mortgage, right? No, we've determined you can afford 90, right? We'd all love a lower mortgage, but you do what you can within these ratios that we've established. And once you've maximized your purchasing power through your mortgage, if that's not enough, we'll fill the gap up to this, right? So there I would call it like the assistance, even though it's all lumped together, there's 3 conceptual elements to that assistance, right? They're getting $4,000 of closing cost assistance, $3,000 of down payment assistance, and another $7,000 of mortgage buy down, principal buy down, what, however you want to characterize that. The $7,000 is a function of being through buying down the mortgage, reducing their monthly payment. The first $7,000 is, even if they can afford the monthly payment, it's just hard to come up with $7,000 out of pocket if you're only making $36,000 a year, right? Yeah, I think part of it is, and that's, again, we can do one more run through when we come back from lunch, but part of this is that's what the sheet's trying to do for us, is we're balancing that. Hey, we're trying not to over leverage anybody, but we're also not trying to unnecessarily subsidize them lower than what we need. We're trying to make sure that everybody's still expected to do sort of as much as they can to help themselves, and then we fill in the difference. Not sure. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So I think, again, part of it, just to keep everybody on time, we're about 10 minutes over, not the end of the world. The plan is,
Yep.
presumably there's food somewhere around here. Doesn't look like it's walkable. I assume you're gonna have to get in your cars. For those people online, we still have enough time that we can get back here by 1 o'clock, those here in the room.
Yes.
Yeah, so we'll start again at 1, and we'll continue. We'll kind of just spend a little bit more wrap up on playing with the sheet, and then we'll get into the other pieces.
All right. For